Good afternoon. Welcome to the SA Pavilion on the Eskom hosted event. Our event is titled Right Financing for Just Energy Transition and Bridging the Funding Gap. And we have spoken about the need to ramp up transmission investments. That's why we invited the PMU also, and also making sure that we use appropriate funding mechanisms in terms of funding the transition. So without further ado, I would like to call upon the Eskom CEO, Khalib Kasim. He's been with Eskom for 21 years as the CFO, and he's the acting CEO. Can you please give us the context and the opening remarks? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, it's my first COP. I'm honored to be here and to spend a few minutes with you. This is probably my easiest speech that I'm doing, just an introduction. I'll let Vikesh and Priscilla do the hard work. And just maybe also for my self-interest, I can't wait for the incoming CEO to start. I can get back to some normality. But colleagues, it's great to be here. I think first and foremost where Eskom is and our importance not only to the South African economy, but more importantly in terms of the journey of decarbonization. We all understand in terms of our emissions and what we contribute to the environment and how damning it is. And that is why Eskom's transition in terms of our own journey around the just energy transition is critical to ensure that South Africa succeeds in its journey. We've learned a lot from Komati as our first station to go on this new and second life experience. A lot of learnings taken on board, and through the PCC and their chairpersons and Dr. Crispian Oliver, the report they've produced, we've accepted it. We recognize the findings there, and we want to learn from it, not only for Eskom, but for our country's sake. Colleagues, in terms of where we find ourselves, I think first and foremost, in terms of the energy trilemma of security and security of supply, we understand and we know what unreliable supply means to the country, to the economy. It's the most expensive form of electricity or no electricity. And that is why in addressing the energy crisis, we also needed to revisit our journey map in terms of the just energy transition. Vikesh will expand a bit more on that. But while we're doing that, we need to ensure that this transition has equity built in terms of access of electricity, and also in doing all of this, as we will touch on in terms of funding of the just energy transition, and in particular the transmission, it does come at a cost. And how do we balance that with regard to affordability? But most importantly, we need to move away from coal. The stations will come to the end of their natural coal lives, and then we need to manage that in terms of a second life and the communities that rely on it. So we need to work in conjunction with the communities going forward. So colleagues, I think from our side as Eskom, we are committed to this, but most importantly, from a timing perspective, we need to balance the security of supply with the transition towards renewables in the form of PV, wind, but coupled with battery storage, because we can't as a country just deal with the renewables without having the backup in the form of batteries or other alternative transition technologies. We await keenly the upcoming IRP 2023, and what does that mean? From an Eskom perspective, we have the support of the board that on an equal footing, Eskom will also like to participate in our renewable technologies going forward. But most importantly, as we do this, we can't go back. If I use my other more important hat, the finance hat, we can't repeat the mistakes of the past and put Eskom in a position where we're going to be consistently dependent on the fiscus in terms of equity support, debt relief, and guarantees. The fiscus only has a limited amount of capacity available to it. It has to balance the requirements not only of what Eskom needs, Transnet, but more importantly, all the challenges and all the other components and projects in terms of our country's requirements. So while we do this, from an Eskom perspective, we need to ensure as we unbundle and separate that these entities of transmission, distribution, and generation can also stand on their own feet in terms of their balance sheets going forward. So colleagues, this was the easiest speech I've ever done in my tenure as CEO, so thanks for inviting me to COP. I look forward to the next ones. Thank you, and I'll hand over to Vikesh to take us to the just energy transition and what we've learned as Eskom. Thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. I've got the easy job as well. I'm just going to spend a few minutes discussing the Eskom JET strategy. We have an approved JET strategy, board approved that is. There's full alignment amongst ourselves from an Eskom perspective, from a board perspective, and the central concept of our JET strategy speaks to this. Caleb spoke about it earlier, the energy trilemma. This morning when the minister spoke about the JET IP, she spoke to these elements as well. And there is consistency in our messaging, and there's full alignment from an organizational perspective regarding the importance of the just energy transition and the role that it plays in the country and in the organization, in transforming the organization into what it should be and what it could be. So the elements of the of the energy trilemma are quite obvious, and I think it is quite well understood as well. I wouldn't spend too much of time on that, except to emphasize a few key points. When we speak about, and it largely depends on how we position our arguments. If we position the argument from a climate change perspective regarding the transition from fossil fuels, we end up with an unnecessary discussion regarding those that contributed it should be paying towards the rectification thereof. How much does South Africa actually contribute, or how much have we historically contributed? So when we position it from an economic perspective, we look at security of supply, we look at renewables being the cheapest form of electricity, we look at, from a security of supply perspective, we're also addressing capacity and the quality of supply, but we look at lowest cost to address the access and affordability. So if your question is on economics, we're addressing the affordability component. If the question is regarding sustainability, we're addressing the climate change perspective. But importantly, there are many elements, and South Africa has a triple challenge of poverty, unemployment, and inequality that this strategy also speaks to. And I'm just going to speak to very high-level elements of the JET strategy. What is important is that we are technology agnostic, provided we pursue a low carbon future. So we don't have a position regarding renewables versus nuclear versus pumped hydros. We embrace all technologies as part of our energy mix, provided it is done at the least cost to address the first component of the energy trilemma, which was access and affordability, provided it supports the third component was sustainability. And importantly, from a system perspective, we believe that not only does it, we don't necessarily need to focus only on security of supply, but equally important is the quality of supply. Components or aspects like frequency, inertia, and system balancing are key to the organization regarding balancing the system. And that's where the Eskom JET strategy comes in. We have established our strategy based on three pillars, which are obvious: the just, the energy and the transition component. The just speaks to doing better for all, creating quality jobs, right? And that is a no-brainer as such. But importantly, it was mentioned on a few occasions already, providing a second life to our power stations. And in the case of Komati, in the case of Camden, and in the case of Grootplay, providing a third life to those power stations, because those plants were mothballed in the early 90s. They were shut down because we had a surplus of capacity. When we brought back those units, they were brought back with a defined time period. And in many cases, the time period as such has either it had either lapsed or it is coming very close to the end of its design life. However, we've taken a decision as an organization, and as I've mentioned, it is a board-approved strategy, that we will decouple the station decommissioning from our repurposing and repowering initiatives. And that is key, because in a country that's facing an energy crisis, we cannot shut down any of our producing plant prematurely. So we need to embrace a smooth transition that allows us to build renewables, that allows us to build new generating capacity, as well as repurpose those power stations. So we classify the JET under two components. One is the repurposing component that looks at economic diversification. It looks at alternative forms of employment for those communities that have been established around our power stations. And the second component is a repowering component that we classify as being, as I've indicated earlier, low carbon technologies. And in our case, we've identified wind, PV, battery energy storage, and synchronous condensers as being the technologies that we will be adopting at these power stations in the short term. We are open to other technologies like gas, like other forms, like even pumped hydros comes into our energy mix as we proceed and as we shut down our coal plants. So those are the three elements, and it speaks to our ambition. And the ambition from Eskom perspective is based on what we call the 5 E's of the just energy transition. That is the energy component that speaks, and perhaps the next slide speaks to that, it does. The energy component that speaks to, as I've indicated already, technology agnostic, low carbon future. The economy, where we focus on economic development, growth, job creation, which is also speaks to the other E regarding employment. So the opportunities, we've conducted socio-economic impact assessments at all 10 of our power stations in the province. And from that, we've identified the opportunities that are presented from a repowering and a repurposing perspective from all of these components. And we find that there is a net positive impact on job creation if we were to pursue the build program that we have as an organization and as a country as well. The obvious one is the environment, regarding sustainability of the environment, regarding pursuing a low carbon future, which we acknowledge and we accept as being a direct cause of the climate change and the challenges that we face as a planet these days. I want to focus a little bit on equity before I hand back to the facilitator. And equity speaks to treating each community differently, providing bespoke solutions to address community needs and taking everybody along the journey with us. So it does not speak to applying a one-size-fits-all solution to all communities, but engaging deeply stakeholders, getting their involvement, understanding what's important to them, and providing solutions that creates jobs, that creates quality jobs, and that assists us in delivering on our just energy transition. This is a very high-level indication of the JET strategy. As I've indicated, it is approved by our board, and we are pursuing this. And key to this is decoupling of our initiatives from our repurposing and repowering. And what that means is that before we shut down any of our units, we intend having new generating capacity at those sites. We intend having economic diversification at those sites. And that's principally why we are here today in this session, to look at the financing mechanisms that would assist us and support us in delivering on our ambition of a just energy transition. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We want to welcome you also, Wendy from the World Bank, to our panel. So earlier on, we spoke about right financing, so that refers to appropriate funding mechanisms. And we spoke about bridging the funding gap. As we know that there's divestment and upscaling of investment for renewables. So through that divestment from coal and the scaling up of investment from renewables, there's a funding gap in between that we are also trying to manage. So I've got the funders as my panelists, and we also have the PMU, and there's a reason why she is amongst the funders. So there is a report, a study that the PMU has undertaken in terms of the transmission financing models. And so we've got Joanne. Joanne is the CEO, has occupied the position of the CEO of the NBI since 2011. And prior to that, he was a DDG in the climate change for the Department of Environmental Affairs. Welcome, Joanne. And Joanne is now heading the JET PMU, the JET IP PMU. So, Joanne, in terms of your study, when it comes to models, really, I've just mentioned 4 things that here we need. We need a speed up, in terms of procurement and implementation. And also we need a model that will provide access to multi-users and also reduce the cost to the grid. And also the model that will be clear in terms of what risk are we mitigating. So if you can just coming on that question, in terms of the grid capacity, there's no transition without transmission. So hence we want to start with you and just take us through your findings, also what would be relevant to South Africa.
Okay, thank you, Priscilla. And I must tell you, I feel like an imposter a number of times over. Firstly, is sort of sitting with the funders is the one side of it. But also just to say that Neil Cole and Sue Lund from the PMU team worked in a significant way on the issues around transmission and the recommendations that we have made. So I think importantly, what we were looking at was the fact that from Eskom's transmission development plan, what we understood is that to be able to roll out renewables at the scale that would be needed going forward, you have to build 10 times the amount of transmission line than we normally do. So 14,000 kilometers of transmission over the next decade. It's a huge ask. And so that's the one side of the problem. I think the other side of the problem we discussed this morning, which is given the Eskom debt moratorium, is Eskom's inability to borrow over the next 3 years. And so what we did was to work with National Treasury in a study that was done by Genesis Analytics and that was funded by the AFDB. And what we looked at was potentially off-balance sheet financing mechanisms that could be used to support the rollout of the grid and to support the expansion of the grid. And I'm not going to go into all of the detail of it, but essentially we looked at a set of public-private partnership models. And there is other work that has been done in the country over the last year that I think is important to acknowledge, including the work that has been done by the University of Stellenbosch. Eskom itself has been working with the DBSA on PPP models. And it's just flown out of my head, but there is, National Treasury has been engaging again with the IFC. So I think internally we need to bring all of this work together. But in the implementation plan, and I'll give you the reference, it's page 75 to 80, you can read the conclusions on transmission. We think that independent power transmission projects are probably what we should be going through in terms of bringing in private investors to construct, own, and operate its assets on a number. There are different ways of doing it. You can build, operate, transfer. You can build, transfer, operate. There's a whole set of options and modalities around that. But it has been done successfully, and it will allow private investors to fund the project using their own resources, including their own equity and raising debts in a special purpose vehicle. And then the utility purchases it. I think important, I should have said at the beginning, our assumption is that the grid remains a public good and remains in the ownership of government. Very importantly, we aren't talking about the privatization of the grid at any level. So that really is what there is, a set of recommendations that looks at. I think that, yeah, I don't know if there's time to go into the detail of all of it, but I think that these independent power transmission projects have been implemented successfully right around the world, and there is very good developing country experience of them and their ability to really be a cost-effective way of building out the grid fairly rapidly. So I think that is what I want to say for it. In terms of the funding side of it, we looked at the current state of the IPG pledges. And in our view, there is quite a lot of that package that could be directed towards investment in transmission, probably around anything up to 700 million euros in concessional loans, guarantees. There's the AFDB, the UK guarantee to the AFDB, where there is the potential to use that finance for the grid. And then there is a commercial loan element that could also be used to support it. Importantly, at the African Climate Week in Nairobi this year, we worked with the US government, who hosted a roundtable that brought together a very wide range of both private and public sector financiers, so both DFIs, MDBs, as well as private capital. And what was very clear from that conversation was that the problem we have is not a finance problem. The financiers are queuing up. I think the issue is to be able to decide on the model, to decide on the procurement modality, and to be able to also, I think importantly, agree on the socio-economic benefit that we want to accrue from such a large infrastructure rollout. And I think that if we can get that lined up, then I have a strong feeling that the money will be able to flow. So thank you, Priscilla. Let me stop there.
Thank you. And we know that the success of the JET IP will depend on the scale and availability of concessional funding. So we have also done a bit of work with the DBSA, as you have said, in terms of the PPP framework. And I've got Matapelo Malawu, who's representing the CEO of the DBSA. Matapelo is the head of the energy and ICT of the DBSA. So Matapelo, just in terms of what role do you think the development bank, which is the DBSA, play in unlocking the much needed funding required? And I'm not just talking about concessional finance, I'm talking about the grants and the relevant sources, and in terms of alternative also funding that should be made available. So if you can also please touch a bit on the PPP framework that we're busy with, at a programmatic approach and the importance. Thank Thank you.
Thanks, Priscilla. So, I mean, I think that we cannot talk about, access to finance if we don't talk quite elaboratively about the energy trilemma that we spoke about earlier, right? Which effectively talks about affordable access to energy.
They don't hear. I think that they don't hear you. They hear me.
Yeah, so that sounds better, yeah. So as I was saying, we cannot talk about, the affordable access to energy if we don't unpack this energy trilemma, right? And what I mean by that is that, going back to your question about how do we scale up the level of funding required to be able to not only fund, for instance, new energy generation capacity, but also to fund, grid infrastructure, is that the way we look at funding as well is that we've got funding partners as well. So, I mean, DBSA plays across the entire funding value chain, right from, preparation where we actually work with municipalities in regards to the infrastructure rollout, but equally we provide funding to sort of embedded generation projects where we work with the private sector to, to fund CNI projects, for instance. But the point I'm trying to get to is that, with the funding partners that we work with, and on the number of type of funding interventions that we've been able to unlock, is that, we effectively also raise money from the capital markets as well, right? So, and what's important is that we also need to be able to access competitive funding costs, competitive debt funding from our various funding partners, so that we can also provide that, that affordable access to energy that I'm talking about, which then addresses the energy trilemma, which is very key to the just energy transition. So, DBSA, as I've mentioned, we play across the entire funding value chain from project preparation to project planning. And project preparation is very key, right? Because that's the catalytic funding that we're talking about, which in effect assists in terms of unlocking capital to fund, to make projects a lot more bankable. That's what we're needing, right? So not every project that comes into the banking system is bankable. The role that a DFI such as DBSA plays is that additionality, the principal role of additionality, where we come in and we unlock funding to be able to make these projects bankable, right? So, and what's also key is the fact that we typically look at the funding of projects at a programmatic level and not just funding, individual projects, which is very key. So, Joanne spoke about the grid infrastructure, and DBSA has been very instrumental in terms of assisting Eskom in terms of looking at the various funding modalities around this. So, and that will be done at a program level. So we're looking at there are basically 4 different types of modalities that one can look at, and she spoke quite articulately about the ownership model. So where, for instance, the private sector doesn't necessarily have to own the infrastructure. That infrastructure can be held and owned and retained by the state. But then we look at, obviously, the risk transfer. So who's best placed to then manage that risk becomes very key, right? So, I mean, the models that one often typically looks at when we look at this, and it's very akin to, for instance, the toll road model, as well as the Gautrain rapid railway system that's been done quite well in South Africa. So where you, for instance, have a build, own, operate, transfer model, where the private sector effectively builds, they then design the actual infrastructure, and then operate it throughout the life of the concession. And then at the end of the concession, then we transfer it back to the state, the rightful owner of that infrastructure. So, and it's important, obviously, the role that DFIs will play going forward in terms of providing, concessional funding as well as credit enhancement instruments, to provide that sort of blended funding element in terms of providing more competitive funding and crowding in that private investment in this, yeah.
Thank you. And in terms of the World Bank, we have successfully concluded a facility where I was honored to be the lead negotiator in terms of the Komati EJP, and obviously there are lessons learned there. And what was another vital feature about the facility was it was embedding the social aspects. So that was what was unique about that. Those were not easy negotiations when we started because it couldn't be business as usual. That's why we're talking about right financing. It couldn't be business as usual when we're negotiating something different because transition is something different. So I would like you to come in there. Wendy Hughes is the regional director for infrastructure for the Western and Southern Africa for the World Bank. So I would like you to come in on the question drawing from the pilot, that we've just done. I've just alluded on in terms of the funding mechanisms, more features that we would like to draw on that facility that are vital to enable the just energy transition.
Hello? Yes, okay, sorry. Thanks, Priscilla. Yeah, so I should start by saying that the World Bank we felt very privileged to be working with Eskom and South Africa to do the first pilot of the coal decommissioning and repurposing. South Africa is at the forefront of this approach, and so I think understandably there will be things that are learned from this project that will be taken on board, and I think it will improve and be used to make subsequent projects or the overall program smoother and I think more impactful. So as Joanna said, there was a report, or there has been a report done, which I think provided some extremely useful input and or lessons already. And these certainly, I think, as Caleb said, will be taken on board, and from the World Bank side also. But just to share some perspectives from the World Bank side, I think first of all, the overarching view, I think, is that really to recognize that the transition touches all parts of society and the economy at least through the jobs agenda and through the power supply agenda. So everybody is going to be affected one way or another. And because of that, it is absolutely critical that there is full alignment with the country context and programs, lots of consultation, really shaping the broader policy environment across many sectors to make sure that the policy environment is appropriate for these kind of exercises, and that the design of decommissioning and repurposing is fully aligned with the government and the societal context. So I think this message that you can't isolate it as a single project. It is by its nature going to touch everybody and all parts of the economy and society. The second thing is the just is the most important word there. I think, as you know, South Africa is leading the view and demonstrating that you can't have a transition if it's not just. So we talk about it as if you can have, an energy transition, and then a just energy transition. But I think the view from the World Bank is you can't have an energy transition unless it's just, because it is just too difficult to implement. So the people part of it is really critical. That means lots of consultation, lots of really understanding the concerns, assessing the concerns, and proactively putting in place measures that will address the issues of people who are going to be impacted in a negative way. Secondly, you have to take into context the specific country context. So in South Africa, clearly load shedding is a massive issue throughout the economy. So as I think maybe Caleb said, you can't really talk about closing down operational power plants until something is coming up to replace them and actually increase the capacity. So the timing, I think, is absolutely key. And of course, the transmission is the essential component that's needed for the upscaling. One other point really to kind of emphasize, it seems very obvious, but it's worthwhile saying that it's new. It's an energy transition. Everybody is doing this for the first time. And that means that there's a lot of need for technical assistance and capacity building and real-time learning with countries that are also going through or tackling the same kind of issues at the same time. So being able to provide the support to not only the government and Eskom, but to the communities and provincial governments and others who are working to see how all parts of this equation can be made to balance. I think this upfront technical assistance and capacity building is critical. Concessional financing has been mentioned, and of course bringing the private sector. Just the nature of the scale of investment in the power sector that's needed, transmission and generation, it's impossible to see how this could be done in a public-only way, and also the government has made very clear that they don't expect it to be public-only. So keeping in mind how the private sector can be brought in is, I think, also part of the lessons from Komati. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. So it was great actually to see the transition finance in play, as it's a new class of capital that is not even clearly defined even in the literature, but it was really refreshing to see it at play in terms of the contribution to the Komati. And unfairly so, I'm an embedded researcher on transition finance on my PhD, so it was just really an unfair advantage for me, seeing it at play, just to mention. And yes, Simon, you played as a GEP a very important part in enabling the EJP itself, you know, in collaboration with the World Bank. What has then the GEP's role being in financing the South Africa JET, and how can philanthropic capital be used to bridge the financing gap? We've been talking about financing gap, and also I want you to also talk to the triple P and adding the other P, which is the fourth P to the triple P, which is, you know, the philanthropy. If you can touch on that also, because we want to add that fourth P.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much, Priscilla. I'm a bit daunted, you've got a PhD in this subject, so I'll do my best. For those who've not come across GEAP, the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, we represent philanthropic capital, hence Priscilla's reference to the fourth P. We are a new organization. We were created 2 years ago, backed by some of the world's largest philanthropies. And our sole focus is on accelerating renewable energy in developing and emerging countries. So the more middle-income countries like South Africa, but we also work closely with countries such as Indonesia, India, Vietnam, Colombia, Brazil. So countries going through quite similar issues to South Africa. But we also work with the lower income countries who are still grappling with energy access and energy poverty, helping them to electrify straight into renewable energy and not default to fossil fuels. The alliance in our name is fundamental, and we work with every single organization represented here, and are very proud and pleased to be doing so. And I think that is the point. We can't achieve this without collaboration. And we've been working very closely with South Africa for almost 2 years, across the whole spectrum of the system working on this. So we've been working with the presidency, with Eskom, with the Presidential Climate Commission, which we think is a model that is enormously important. We pay tribute to the PCC. It's great to see Crispian here. And we encourage actually all countries to look at this model of the inclusivity of all stakeholders. And as Wendy said, this simply cannot and should not happen unless it's inclusive and just for all members of society. In terms of the financial part of it, the fourth P, as you put it, Priscilla, is, in our view, it's underrepresented in the climate and energy space. Of all global philanthropic spending, less than 2% goes into the climate space. And for what we think is perhaps the existential problem of the planet and people, that is way too low. So we exist to bring philanthropic capital into catalytic blended finance situations in countries such as South Africa, but to do so in a way that is structured, it's focused, it's disciplined, and it is catalytic. And that's what we're partnering with South Africa on. In terms of some of the specifics that you've talked about, I think, as we all know, this is a huge, complex challenge. Every country is facing this challenge. And I want to start, actually, by paying tribute to the team in South Africa who are driving such progress in this. It's often easy for us to focus on the challenges, on the problems, on the difficulty, what's not yet done. But actually, in our view, working globally in this space, South Africa, in totality, is doing a really good job on this. And I really want to call that out. If you look at the situation that's been inherited, the progress that's been made by all parties is really quite significant. And this is building on a renewable sector that's already relatively advanced. The previous years of the REAP rounds are excellent. The private sector has proven its capacity to invest. It's proven its desire to invest. And so there's some great strengths to build on here whilst we all go to this next stage. So where specifically can philanthropy be helpful? Two areas in our view. First of all, others have touched on it, using our grant capital to support the capacity building across the government system and the stakeholder system to play their part. And as colleagues on the panel know, we've rapidly worked with different parts of South Africa to build their technical, financial, and project skills to engage in the JET-P process and to negotiate with the IPG. These are complicated financial negotiations. To do the modeling, to do the planning, to do the implementation work, to support the invaluable work of the PCC. So that's one area where, through pure grant capital, we can support the capacity building that we've done in partnership with colleagues like the AFD. The second area is on the catalytic role of blended finance. So, for example, not only is our capital flexible, it is hopefully fast. So with partnership of the World Bank, we're very proud of work we've done jointly, where the World Bank's much bigger program has needed certain things unblocked with technical studies and similar, where we can move fast to provide that study, fund it, get that blockage dealt with, and then the World Bank's larger capital can roll forward. And then fundamentally with the private sector. South Africa is blessed with a deep private sector as well as access to the international markets. And that's, I think, where the transmission issue comes in. The quantum required, as Joanne talked about, it's way too big for non-private sector funding. But also the advantage of private sector models is that they have an inbuilt self-sustaining discipline to them, that the commercial profit motive forces us all to find a model that should be sustainable. And the role of not just philanthropic capital, but the concessional capital from AFD and DBSA and the World Bank and other parts of the IPG can then build on top of that. So we are involved in the studies looking at the transmission funding models. As Joanne said, the devil is in the detail. And also, we would encourage South Africa to try and pick as fast as possible a handful of specific transmission initiatives, either extending, expanding, strengthening, or similar. Pick a handful, let us all figure out what could be the right financing model, get it going. It won't be perfect, and then we can learn from that and all adjust the model and expand it and improve on it. Because this is really complicated, and so waiting for perfection or trying to address all the transmission issues in one go, we think is unrealistic. And so we are very proud to be in the tent with colleagues on the panel and in South Africa to try and move the transmission space forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, there's a big role for philanthropies. We obviously are facing barriers, especially on the transmission side, in terms of the PPP, in terms of the ownership challenges, where there's complexities for multi-users and also revenue models. There's a lot of issues that definitely would need, expertise, help from, and that technical assistance, really. Thank you very much. And Matilde, We've worked a lot with AFD, very exciting, innovative things we're embarking on. And so my boss is here, I must be careful. Before the embargo, we were working on a very exciting result-based model, you know, with AFD. And Matilda, I would like you to showcase that also here so that also the other DFIs can adopt in these innovations that we suggest. And really when we're speaking about reform, we see it in action in terms of the DFIs, where we bring the models and they improve on them and really embrace them, because we are the ones that knows what is our need. Matilda is the head of the climate at AFD, the French bank, and so I would like you to come in, Matilda. You touch on what we started before the announcement of the embargo to the Eskom borrowing, and you tell us a bit more about what inspired the approach also, and how you judge it superior than the traditional methods of doing things. Thank you.
Thank you, Priscilla, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate in this panel. This topic is really dear to my heart. I visited South Africa the first time more than 10 years ago, as I was working on the first wind farm of Eskom. So I've known you for a while, and what is happening in this great country with those great people is indeed very important, and I really concur with what has been said on the quality, on the courage which is happening with this transition in South Africa. So I told you that we were working already on this wind farm more than 10 years ago. It's running, huh? No worries. But it shows that we were already involved, of course, in the transition of South Africa before it was even called the JETP. And we had started discussion indeed with Eskom on how to support and stand really on their side, as they were facing so many challenges due to the energy trilemma that we heard, due to the social impacts, of course, including into their workforces, to be able to implement this transition. And we came up also taking into consideration what a development finance institution is and its mandate as per the Paris Agreement. We're here in the COP. A DFI is here to support each country, party to the Paris Agreement, and the partners within these countries on their own pathways and alignment to Paris Agreement. So South Africa being so involved and so committed to progress in this matter, we thought that we should start developing financing tools to really support this pathway more than dedicated investment. And that it was most probably the only way to be able to cover something which is very difficult in terms of financing, which is how to reduce the stocks of fossil fuel and how to support a partner which is shutting down. So there have been other, of course, options, and notably the Comati case is, of course, a very good example. But to come at scale, to avoid the deal by deal, we need at a point in time to agree on a way to support the partners on their business model as they will evolve, as long as we are able to follow their commitments and the impacts of this commitment on their emission and on their trajectory. So we agreed indeed to work with this open mind with Eskom. One should not be mistaken, it's actually very demanding. because it needs to build a lot of trust, a lot of comfort on the investment plan, on the trajectory, on the internal processes of the utilities. So all this needs to come online for this to happen. This is why we indeed decided to support with JAP the JET strategy of Eskom, which was the main strategy on which we would, and we hope we will, still finance Eskom future business model. I know, I mean, you referred, of course, to the decision that for a few years' time you cannot borrow directly from us, but we know also that financing will still be needed, and we will be along you to be able to cover that. I'd like to come to another part of our commitment, which is the social aspect of it. Within the JETP, AFD and France has promised through AFD 1 billion funding, 1 billion euros, sorry. With, of course, the idea to support Eskom, but also to support very much the just part of the transition in South Africa. Eskom being at the center, but not only the only stakeholders involved, and not the only stakeholder able also to provide answers to this topic of the social transition in South Africa. And this is why we are we have developed also a lot of knowledge with regard to inequality and social inclusion in South Africa, together with South African academics and partners and the various ministries in charge. We are working on public policy loan on this topic. And we are also working on 3 key aspects of the transition, which are critical for South Africa, but which are exactly the same in each and every country where you work on JETs, whether or not there is a P, which are training of the workforce. So we are working with Eskom on the Just Transition Labor Center, localization. This is something which is, of course, very important, to work with the countries on their industrial future and how to localize the green job truly, not only in the operation of the plants, but also in all the value chain of the clean energy and the clean developments that will happen there. And therefore, the third part, which is employment, how to support employment, how to make sure that the territories which are the most impacted by the energy transition do benefit from these localizations of employment. So that these are work that we are handling in terms of technical assistance and analysis with South African partners, and that will support our future investment within the JETPs through those public policy landings, and I hope soon through Eskom just energy transition loan, let's call it like that.
Thank you very much. And I have few minutes for questions. Questions are very important. Yes, I see already a hand there. If you can take the mic to the lady.
Hi, thank you. I'm Katrina Lehman-Gruber from Wits University. I have 2 questions. So given that Eskom can't get, is this correct, my understanding? Given that Eskom can't get any of the JETP money directly, does that mean that all the money that is allocated for transmission will go directly to the private sector, so that the private sector will get that money? And then secondly, we know that the tariff reform process is shifting towards more cost-reflective tariffs. Has Eskom calculated how much the proposed plan will increase consumer bills and over what period? And what does that mean for the vast majority of the country who already can't afford electricity? Thank you.
Okay. All right. So I'll let Joanne to take the first one. That one we expected. So I'll let Joanne to take it.
No, I don't think it means that all of this finance will go to the private sector. I mean, you're talking about partnership models. And in those partnership models, firstly, I think that what we were envisaging was firstly a competitive procurement process that would then allow considerations of value for money, value to Eskom, value to the country to be taken into account through a competitive process, and value to communities to be taken into account in the way that these are structured. But secondly, I think that obviously in a public-private partnership, there is an allocation of risk. A lot of it is about who takes on risk and how is the financing structured. And we are hoping that on the one hand, you could de-risk this process, use some of this concessional finance to de-risk, but also to support the public side of the investments that are necessary for it. So I don't think that you're looking at, I don't think that this is a sort of behind the back way of putting money simply into private sector operators at all. I mean, I think that public-private partnerships are a model that has been used in South Africa over a long period of time. I think that we're going to have to, for something that is happening at the scale of the kind of investment that the grid requires, we're going to need to get a lot more agile and flexible and fast and effective in the way that we run the procurement process, and also in being able to contract in ways that are really in the national interest, which I think is what we would want to see.
Thank you. So I'll let my CEO to take the second one of the cost-reflective tariff. So that one definitely is not directed to the panel.
Thank you. I think just from a regulatory perspective, our assets are recovered over the life of each asset. So the transmission increase in investment or distribution or generation, it won't be an immediate spike in the tariff, but over the life, but there will be an upward movement in terms of the tariff. Secondly, I think we must also appreciate that in Eskom's implementation of those tariffs and what NERSA has granted, we haven't seen eye to eye on many of them. We've reviewed a number of decisions, so it does take time to follow through in terms of the tariffs. Thank you.
Thank you. For me to be called again to be a moderator, I'll have to stop here. And also, I know that we've got a dead stop of 5 because we've got another engagement. But thank you very much. I still can't believe it that I made it in time because I'm very passionate about this subject. Thank you to my esteemed panelists for your insights, for your expertise. And, you know, the discussion really shed some light. I hope it have shed some light in the financing landscape and how we can importantly bridge the funding gap. Thank you.